Hey everyone, it's Casey, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the topic of why traditional reading workshop didn't work for me. I'm not going to just cast a bunch of problems and not give any solutions tonight. I'm going to lay out the issues that I had with reading workshop when I taught it for the first couple of years, once I started teaching it in middle school language arts, and I'm going to just share what I shifted to since then. Before I start, though, I think it's important to define what I mean by reading workshop because I think it means a lot of different things to different people. So, first of all, reading workshop, how I define it, I think it's a literacy framework that a teacher would use daily. They'd have a read aloud that they're using every day with students. There would be a reading mini lesson, and then students would have their own independent reading book that they are reading and then applying that reading mini lesson to their independent reading book. Students would select their own independent reading books and they would read them at their pace. And then also the teacher with the read aloud would kind of just be reading it at their own pace and then just moving into a new read aloud. The teacher would also be determining what students need and would be performing like process mini lessons or academic mini lessons. In contrast, how I'm defining reading units, it would be a literacy framework that would still be based in a reading workshop model. The big difference, though, would be that the units have a starting and stopping point, and that there would be very defined standards and goals of each unit that the teacher would lay out and have planned and be covering. So I'm now going to just dive into why traditional reading workshop did not work for me, but reading units did. So the first reason that traditional reading workshop did not work for me is because my interactive read aloud was always from the same genre. So I'm kind of a sucker for realistic fiction. Love realistic fiction. Like I could go over to my bookshelf right now and pull out some of my favorite books that I love reading aloud to students. I love reading, House Arrest, The Skin I'm In. I've read Walk Two Moons aloud to students, Holes, Counting by Sevens, Wonder. What else have I read up there to students? The Art of Racing in the Rain I've read. So I mean, all these realistic fiction books, like I could read them over and over again to students. And so I tended to always pick that same genre. And when I shifted to reading units, each reading unit was based off of a different genre, and the read aloud had to match that genre. And I remember the first time I was about to teach Greek mythology for the first time, and I was like dreading the unit. I did not want to start the unit. I knew very little about Greek mythology, kind of had it in my head that I didn't think students would be very interested in it either. And of course, started the read aloud, started the student text, and we all learned so much, loved it. It was like one of my favorite reading units to this day that I've done. And it just goes to show that sometimes when you step a little bit outside of your comfort zone, especially as a teacher where you have to learn new things alongside the students, it makes learning a lot more exciting. And I also noticed that having the different genres across the year reach a lot more students. Different students are interested in different genres. So that was the first thing that reading units solved. The second, my gradebook lacked evidence of student learning in relation to reading. So when I was doing traditional reading workshop, I really struggled with what to actually put in my gradebook. I would do some formative assessments here and there, but I never really had a clear plan for what I wanted to assess, when I wanted to assess it, what my formative assessment was going to be, what my summative assessment was going to be. And I hate focusing in on that stuff, but at the same time, reading is one of those things where if you kind of let it be very hypothetical, you can go a long time without really knowing if your students are growing as readers. And we can't always just rely on a universal screener or a state test or something like that. We should have classroom data more than formative notes that we're taking. It should be more than that. So the thing that reading units did were the reading units really laid out a plan of what standards I wanted to hit, how I was going to formatively assess those standards across the unit, and how I was going to summatively assess the standards at the end of the unit. Next up, my curriculum did not spiral. So what I mean by that is I might have taken a reading skill like summarizing and taught it during one part of reading workshop in a sequence of mini lessons for maybe even like up to 5 days. And then I wouldn't necessarily formally teach summarizing again across the rest of the year. And that really doesn't work. Teaching summary in a realistic fiction book is totally different than what summary looks like when students are reading a nonfiction short article. So students need to be practicing these reading skills over and over again in relation to different genres. So that we're not only teaching them that reading skill, but we're teaching how to apply it in many different contexts. So that is a huge thing with the reading units, having those different reading skills. We have like 6 priority standards that we use. So we are always focusing in on like inferring, finding the theme, connecting key ideas, details, and events, looking at words, and looking at point of view and perspective. So those standards are going to spiral again and again in each unit, so students have a chance to apply them. Next up, I lost perspective of grade level reading standards and what student proficiency would look like on those standards. So how many of you have ever made the mistake of like asking students, hey, do you remember back in the previous grade level when you learned blah, blah, blah? And they're all like, no, we never learned that. I've never heard of that before. It's my first time in my whole life that I've ever heard the term figurative language or summary or inference. And we kind of make that mistake of then starting over. And I think it was when I had my first son as literacy coach, that was my first year that I didn't have a class of my own. And I spent the whole year like really immersing myself in the different grade levels and trying to study what a student journey looked like in our middle school from 5th grade to 6th grade to 7th grade to 8th grade. And one of the big takeaways from that year for me was just the idea that we seem to start over a lot. Like we looked at what our lowest group of students didn't know, and we started there. And that's how we were trained to do it. We were trained to be responsive to students' needs, which is a great thing. But I think you also have to have a really good perspective of what are those grade level standards. As a 6th grade language arts teacher, a 7th grade language arts teacher, what are you teaching to? Who are you teaching to? What standards should you be teaching to in a universal instruction? Obviously, like in a small group setting, during an intervention period, you definitely want to be targeting specific reading gaps that students have. But as far as your universal instruction, you should know what those grade level standards are and how they build and progress year after year. The next thing is I didn't understand the need for common instructional practices and common curriculum. So having both. So when we first started our journey with reading workshop, we did all of our professional development around instructional practices. So we did everything around like the idea of how do you do interactive read aloud? How do you do guided reading? How do you do a reading conference? How do you conduct a mini lesson? And all of our professional development really centered around those instructional practices and having those common instructional practices, which is a great thing. But what we didn't have common then is actually what we were putting into those instructional practices. And each grade level still kind of kept what they have done in the past and molded it into a reading workshop traditional framework, and just kept putting those types of things into it. And so like I think that we were great on our instructional practices, but we didn't have that common curriculum. So really, if you don't have both, if you don't have the how and the what, you don't really have anything. And excuse me, my dog is really snoring right now. Sully, please wake up. Sorry about that. So So having the how and the what is really important. And I think when we went and shifted into more of the reading units, we got a lot more clear on the what, and we're able to pair that with our common instructional practices, which made it much more powerful. Number 6, I spent way too much time on process-based mini lessons. So as a middle school teacher, I think like one of the biggest things I heard also as a middle school literacy coach is students who have been in the reading workshop for years and years and years, like for example, the first 20 days. Like, do we really need to do the first 20 days anymore when students have been in this traditional reading workshop framework like forever? And my answer to that would be probably not. Like, I think it is important, like if your students have never experienced a reading workshop before, that you do spend time laying that foundation the first 20 days. But as far as like taking an entire day to practice something that students behaviorally should do during reading workshop, I have really shifted to making sure that each day is an academic-based mini lesson, and that those process-based mini lessons are more just filtered into what we do, how we practice. I don't ignore setting those expectations, because reading workshop in middle school will never work if you don't have really clear expectations that students practice. But I think taking entire days to practice kind of the behavior of reading workshop is a practice that we have stopped in lieu of making sure each day is academic, and we're just practicing those behaviors alongside that. Oops. And the last one I have is there were no starting points and stopping points. It was just a big continuous blob. And that is how I really truly describe it, as a blob. I felt like when I was doing reading workshop traditionally, it was just like on to the next read aloud. Students are on to their next independent reading book. There was really no start. There was no stop. We just kept rolling and rolling, throwing mini lessons in, doing this and then that, and what should we do next? And it just seemed very much like running a marathon, that we were like running off course and didn't know where the starting and stopping point was. And reading units, this is probably my favorite thing that reading units bring, where you can have a starting point of a unit, a stopping point of a unit, clear goals of what you want to accomplish throughout that unit, a read aloud that matches with that genre, student text that match with that genre. And it just provides a lot more clarity, a lot more of a year-long scope and sequence that students can follow. So those are the 7 reasons why traditional reading workshop didn't quite work for me, but adding in reading units onto a reading workshop framework is definitely working a lot better. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I will put the link to the full blog post down in the comments, so you can read the full blog post and kind of see all the details and ins and outs of the 7 points that I just described. But thank you so much for watching. And if you have any questions, definitely leave them for me as well.